You think you know Rumpelstiltskin, a strange little man who spins straw into gold, a clever queen who guesses his name, a child saved at the last moment. A story about the dangers of making deals with magical creatures, about the power of knowing someone's true name. But what if I told you that Rumpelstiltskin is one of the oldest stories humanity has ever told? A tale that predates the Bible, predates written language itself, stretching back 4,000 to 6,000 years into the Bronze Age. Because buried beneath this fairy tale lies something far more disturbing than an imp who wants a baby. This is a story about debt so crushing it could only be paid in human life. About fathers who sold their daughters to save themselves. About kings who threatened murder to fill their treasuries. About the actual legal codes that made children into collateral, that turned wombs into commodities, that encoded into law the right of creditors to seize your firstborn child if you couldn't pay what you owed. Once you understand what the glass coffin really meant in medieval Germany, once you learn why Rumpelstiltskin tears himself in half, once you discover the Scottish folklore of the tithe to hell and realize what that child was actually being traded for, you'll never see this story the same way again. Welcome back. Before we discover what Rumpelstiltskin really is, we need to understand what this story actually was. Not entertainment, not a bedtime tale, but a survival manual encoded in symbols because the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. Let me take you back 4,000 years. Not to a time of magic and wonder, but to a world where debt was a physical burden with lethal consequences. In the Bronze Age societies where this story originated, debt wasn't an abstraction tracked in ledgers. It was carved into clay tablets, witnessed by priests, enforced by the absolute power of kings who could order your execution for failing to deliver what you promised. The impossible task at the heart of Rumpelstiltskin, spinning straw into gold, was never meant to be understood literally. It was a metaphor that every listener would have recognized immediately. An agrarian population facing insurmountable debt to a sovereign or creditor, a demand so impossible that survival required engaging with forces beyond the natural world. Consider the Code of Hammurabi, written around 1750 BCE, roughly contemporary with the origins of this tale. Law 117 states explicitly, "If a man be in debt and sell his wife, son, or daughter, they shall work for 3 years. Human life, specifically that of children, served as the ultimate collateral for economic defaults." This wasn't theoretical. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant shows that debt bondage was the primary form of slavery in the ancient world. Most slaves weren't captured in war. They were debtors and their families, pledged as living collateral when harvests failed or business ventures collapsed. The miller's daughter in Rumpelstiltskin exists in this exact legal landscape. Her father makes a boast he cannot prove, claiming she can spin straw into gold. Law 1 of Hammurabi addresses this directly. If anyone ensnare another, putting a ban upon him, but he cannot prove it, he shall be put to death. The burden of impossible proof rested on the vulnerable, making them targets for judicial execution. But notice who faces the consequences. Not the miller who lied, but his daughter who becomes the currency for his social advancement. Law 210 of Hammurabi makes this explicit. If a man strikes a free woman and she dies, his daughter shall be killed. Female lives were viewed as fungible assets within patriarchal hierarchies, interchangeable units of value that could be sacrificed to settle the debts and crimes of men. The king's demand that the miller's daughter produce gold on pain of death reflects the absolute sovereignty of ancient monarchs, whose power over subjects was total and often extractive. But here's where the story reveals its true horror. When she cannot perform the impossible task, when she faces execution for her father's lie, a stranger appears offering to do the work. For a price. First a necklace, then a ring. These aren't just jewelry. They're personal signifiers, often representing the only wealth a woman might possess as dowry. By taking these, the entity strips her of her identity and her past before he claims her future. And what does he demand as final payment? Her firstborn child. This is the direct cultural memory of debt bondage. In Bronze Age economies, creditors were occasionally barred from taking certain essentials as collateral, a warrior's armor or a peasant's plow, because doing so would deprive the individual of future productivity. But children were often the most valuable and least essential tools of immediate labor, making them prime targets for predatory lending. The requirement that Rumpelstiltskin be paid in a firstborn child encodes an actual practice, documented in legal codes across the ancient Near East. The child is the ultimate collateral, because a child represents future labor, future reproductive capacity, future wealth that hasn't yet been generated but can already be claimed. The story also encodes the mechanisms of debt cancellation that prevented total social collapse. Law 48 of Hammurabi states, if a storm kills the grain, in that year the debtor need not give his creditor any grain. He washes his tablet. The guessing of the name functions as this kind of clean slate, a ritual that obligates the creditor to release the debt. Ancient societies relied on periodic debt cancellation, jubilee years when all debts were forgiven and all bonded servants released, to prevent the complete destruction of the productive population. Without these pressure valves, societies collapsed into rebellion or total depopulation. The name guessing in Rumpelstiltskin represents this ancient understanding that some debts must be breakable, that there must exist a mechanism, however difficult to access, for escaping impossible obligations. The act of spinning straw into gold is not labor, but ritual transformation. From a practical perspective, straw is an impossible medium. It lacks the fibers of flax or wool and cannot be spun into any functional thread. The king's demand is not for a product, but for a miracle, a demand that forces the maiden to engage with the supernatural. This is where the story moves from the economic into the occult, from the legal realm into the realm of forbidden contracts. The spinning wheel carries profound symbolic weight in European mythology. It appears again and again in fairy tales, always at moments of transformation or danger. In Sleeping Beauty, the spindle pricks the princess's finger and casts her into enchanted sleep. In the myths of ancient Greece, the three fates spin, measure, and cut the threads of human life at their wheel. The wheel is an instrument of destiny, and whoever controls the wheel controls fate itself. When Rumpelstiltskin enters the locked room where the miller's daughter sits surrounded by straw, he is not just helping a girl finish her chores. He is seizing control of her destiny. The ritual unfolds over 3 nights, increasing in scale and intensity. This triadic structure mimics the pattern of occult contracts documented in grimoire and demonological texts. 3 is the number of completion, of binding, of sealing a pact that cannot be undone. On the first night, she gives a necklace. On the second, a ring. On the third, she has nothing left to give but a promise, a verbal contract sworn in desperation, and what she promises is the child she doesn't yet have, trading future life for present survival. The gold itself is suspect. In many variants of European folklore, gold obtained through demonic pacts is illusory, fading to leaves or coal by morning, or it carries a curse that brings ruin to whoever possesses it. While the king sees wealth, while he believes he has found a woman who can make him rich beyond measure, the maiden sees only a temporary stay of execution. She has traded death today for something worse tomorrow. This reframes the story as a lose-lose game. If she fails to spin the straw, she dies. If she succeeds, she is wed to her jailer and owes her soul, or her child's soul, to a creature whose true nature she doesn't understand. The domesticity of the setting makes this more disturbing, not less. The locked room, the spinning wheel, the feminine labor of spinning itself. These are the tools and spaces of women's daily lives, now invaded by supernatural predation. The message is clear. There is no safe space. The hearth, the room where women worked, where they created the thread that would be woven into cloth, where they performed, the labor that sustained households, This space can be penetrated by forces that demand payment in blood and future. The transformation of worthless material into precious metal also carries alchemical significance. Alchemy was not just proto-chemistry, but a spiritual practice, the transformation of base matter into higher forms, mirroring the transformation of the human soul from ignorance to enlightenment. But alchemy required years of study, dangerous substances, and often ended in madness or death. The king demands instant alchemy performed by an untrained girl. He demands the impossible and threatens murder if the impossible is not achieved. This is the logic of extractive power. Demand the miracle. Threaten death for failure. And when someone desperate enough makes a bargain with forces they don't understand to survive, claim the results as your rightful property. Rumpelstiltskin is rarely described as human. He is a mannequin, a little man, an imp. The descriptions emphasize his otherness, his wrongness, his fundamental incompatibility with the human world. And his name, when we examine it closely, reveals exactly what he is. The German Rumpelstiltskin is a compound word. Rumpeln means to rumble, to rattle, to make noise like a poltergeist. Stiltchen is the diminutive of stelze, meaning stilt or prop. Put them together and you get something like Little Rumbling Stilt, a name that immediately codes him as both noisy and deformed. The poltergeist connection is significant. In Germanic folklore, the Rumpelgeist was a household spirit that rattled pots, disturbed sleep, and fed on domestic chaos and anxiety. Not a helpful brownie or protective house spirit, but a parasite that thrived on fear and disorder. This suggests that Rumpelstiltskin is a domestic predator, a being that specifically targets the home, the family, the private spaces where women labor and children are born. But there's a darker layer. Linguistic scholars, including those who compiled Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, have pointed to a phallic subtext in the name. Some translations render it as crumpled stalk or wrinkled foreskin, suggesting that Rumpelstiltskin is a personification of predatory male sexuality. The male stranger who enters the private domestic sphere of the maiden. The entity who appears when she is most vulnerable, locked alone in a room, facing death, and offers to save her life in exchange for something she will produce with her body. The physical descriptions consistently emphasize deformity. The archaic German word Stulz refers to someone with a limp or a stilt leg. In European folklore, a physical deformity, particularly a limp or what was called a cloven hoof, was the standard indicator of demonic presence. The devil walks with a limp. Demons reveal themselves through asymmetry. The body that doesn't move correctly signals the soul that doesn't belong in this world. Rumpelstiltskin's limp marks him as fundamentally wrong, as something that shouldn't exist in the human realm but has found a way to cross over. Different cultures gave him different names, but the pattern remains consistent. In Scotland, he's Whoopity Story, the one who whips up dust, a fairy associated with chaotic transformation. In England, he's Tom Tit Tot, a corruption of terms associated with demons and often depicted as a furry black creature with a tail, emphasizing bestial nature. In Italy, Tremotino, Little Earthquake, suggesting an entity capable of overturning the social and physical order. Every name encodes the same truth. This is a creature of disruption, of violation, of boundaries crossed that should remain inviolate. The Swedish variant calls him Titteli Ture, a nonsensical rhythmic name, and explicitly describes him as an ugly dwarf. The Slavic version, Kinkach Martinko, translates to something like broom-like Martin or kinky Martin, referring to a domestic spirit that can be both helpful and destructive. The consistency across cultures is striking. This entity always appears small, always deformed, always associated with domestic spaces and feminine labor, and always demands payment that involves children or future generations. The story has been told in hundreds of languages across thousands of miles, and the core remains identical because the fear it encodes is universal. From a psychological perspective, Rumpelstiltskin functions as what Carl Jung called the trickster archetype, a collective shadow figure that encapsulates all the inferior, undifferentiated, and amoral traits of the psyche. The trickster is neither good nor evil, but represents the chaotic, unpredictable forces that disrupt order and force transformation through trauma. He appears in myths worldwide: Loki in Norse tradition, Anansi in West African tales, Coyote in Native American stories. Always the same pattern: a figure who helps and harms in equal measure, who facilitates necessary change but demands terrible payment. In the narrative of Rumpelstiltskin, the imp serves as a compensatory figure for the ego inflation of the men around the maiden. The miller's boast is a manifestation of his shadow, his greed, and his willingness to sacrifice his daughter for social standing. He wants access to the king. He wants to be seen as important, as the father of someone extraordinary. So he tells a lie that puts his daughter's life at risk. The king's greed is a further extension of this pathology. He doesn't question whether the claim is true. He doesn't care about the girl's welfare. He sees only the possibility of infinite wealth and threatens murder if she cannot deliver it. Rumpelstiltskin appears not as an external villain, but as the inevitable consequence of these men's failures. He is what Jung called the wounded wounder, a being that has been damaged by the same forces it now perpetuates. He facilitates transformation, turning straw into gold, but only through a transaction that replicates his own trauma. Whatever curse or bargain binds him, whatever debt he himself is trying to pay, he survives by passing that burden to others. The psychology becomes even more disturbing when we consider what the child represents. In Jungian terms, the child is the symbol of future potential, of unrealized possibility, of the self that might emerge if development proceeds naturally. Rumpelstiltskin's attempt to claim the child is an attempt to steal potential itself, to prevent the natural development of the psyche and trap it in a cycle of debt and obligation that can never be resolved. The maiden has been forced into premature adulthood, married to a king who threatened her life, and now she must defend the one thing that represents hope for a different future. The fact that she succeeds by discovering his name is crucial. In Jungian psychology, naming the shadow is the first step in integrating it, in transforming unconscious material into conscious awareness where it can be examined and potentially transcended. By speaking his name, the queen doesn't destroy Rumpelstiltskin. She defines him. She reduces him from an infinite threatening presence to a bounded, knowable entity. And once he is known, once his true nature is exposed, his power collapses. Jung wrote extensively about how the trickster appears at moments of psychic crisis, when the ego's inflation has become unsustainable and collapse is imminent. The trickster forces humility through humiliation, growth through trauma. He is the compensatory mechanism that prevents the psyche from destroying itself through grandiosity. The miller's false claim of his daughter's abilities is precisely this kind of ego inflation, and Rumpelstiltskin appears as the inevitable correction. But the correction is not gentle. It threatens to consume everything, to take not just the false claim but the life built on top of it. The only escape is through conscious recognition, through the difficult work of seeing and naming the shadow for what it truly is. The resolution of Rumpelstiltskin hinges entirely on the discovery of the imp's name, a plot point that reflects ancient beliefs about onomastic magic, the power of names. In occult traditions spanning cultures from Egypt to China, from Mesopotamia to medieval Europe, to know a being's true name is to possess their soul's signature and exert total control over their physical and spiritual manifestations. This isn't superstition, it's a worldview in which language and reality are fundamentally connected, where speaking a thing's name is equivalent to grasping its essence. Consider the magical practices documented in grimoires like the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Sworn Book of Honorius. These texts provide elaborate rituals for summoning and binding demons, and the crucial element in every ritual is the name. Without the correct name, precisely pronounced, the ritual fails. The demon cannot be controlled. It might appear, but it will not obey. The name is the binding mechanism, the linguistic chain that prevents the entity from acting on its own will. This is why demons in these traditions guard their true names so carefully, offering false names or titles instead. The Queen's act of naming Rumpelstiltskin is not just a lucky guess. It is a linguistic ritual that collapses his power. Unnamed power is infinite because it cannot be defined or bound. It exists in the realm of pure potential, pure threat. Once the name Rumpelstiltskin is articulated, once those specific syllables are spoken in his presence, the entity is reduced from a supernatural force to a quantifiable subject. Identity becomes essence. There is no separation between the label and the soul. By revealing his name, the imp becomes nakedly exposed, unable to offer any protection against the gaze of the other. The mechanism works like an exorcism or a ghost-laying. Rituals in which knowing and speaking the name of the haunting entity is the first step in banishing it. The power of the contract, which was sealed with words, is redirected back at the contractor through words. The same linguistic magic that allowed him to claim what was never his, the gold, the child, becomes the weapon that defeats him. This is why his undoing involves his own pride. He sings his name around a bonfire, believing it too unusual to be guessed, effectively placing his own vulnerability into the terms of the bargain. The evolution of the story's ending reveals the psychological weight of this moment. In the original 1812 edition collected by the brothers Grimm, Rumpelstiltskin simply flees in a fit of temper when his name is spoken. But by 1857, Wilhelm Grimm rewrote the ending to include the imp tearing himself in two. This act of self-mutilation is symbolically resonant. It represents the dual nature of the trickster finally being ripped apart by the integration of shadow into conscious mind. It also serves as warning about the self-destructive nature of greed and forbidden deals. The power that allowed him to claim what was never rightfully his is the same power that ultimately consumes him. In ancient Egyptian tradition, knowing someone's true name gave you power over their Ka, their life force. In the story of Isis and Ra, the goddess tricks the sun god into revealing his secret name, gaining power over him. In Jewish mysticism, the names of God are themselves creative forces, the 72 names used in Kabbalistic ritual to access different aspects of divine power. In Chinese tradition, knowing the true name of a spirit or demon allows a Taoist priest to command it or banish it. This is not folklore isolated to one culture. It is a nearly universal human understanding that names carry power, that to name a thing is to gain authority over it, and that true names must be protected at all costs. A sociological analysis reveals that Rumpelstiltskin is fundamentally a story about the exploitation of female labor and the systemic control of the female body. The twisted secret of the narrative is its normalization of domestic violence and patriarchal extraction. The daughter in this story has zero agency. She is traded between men like property, like livestock, like the straw she is forced to transform. Her father uses her to gain access to the king uses her to fill his treasury, and Rumpelstiltskin uses her to obtain a child. The king is not a heroic figure. He is a tyrant who threatens to murder a girl if she cannot perform a miracle for his profit. His marriage to her is a transaction, rewarding her not for who she is, but for her supposed magical productivity. He doesn't love her. He doesn't even know her. He sees only what she can produce. And when she becomes queen, when she gives birth to the child he wanted, she is still not safe. Because the child itself has already been promised to another creditor, another man who claims ownership of what her body produced. Some feminist scholars interpret the story as a reflection of the Industrial Revolution, when spinning was systematically taken over by male-owned factories. Spinning had been a domestic, female-led industry for millennia. Women controlled this labor. They set their own pace. They worked in their homes, maintaining autonomy over their time and their products. But industrialization meant mechanization, and mechanization meant centralized production in factories owned by men who hired workers for wages they controlled. Rumpelstiltskin, the male stranger who enters the room to spin for her, represents men invading the domestic sphere to control the production of wealth. The story also mirrors a legal reality where women had no right to their own earnings or property. Everything a woman produced belonged to her father before marriage and her husband after. Her labor was never hers. The gold spun from straw belongs to the king. The child born from her body is claimed by Rumpelstiltskin. She is the site of production, but never the owner of what is produced. This is the reality the story encodes. Female bodies as factories. Female labor as extractable resource. Female reproductive capacity as commodity that can be claimed by whoever holds the contract. Yet despite the grim circumstances, the story offers a survival strategy. She saves herself not through magic or physical violence, but through knowledge and language. By identifying the name of her oppressor, she breaks the hold of the contract. It is an instruction passed from mother to daughter across 4,000 years. Name the thing that controls you. Whether it is an abusive system, an impossible expectation, or a predatory contract, if you can name it precisely, if you can articulate exactly what it is and how it functions, you can begin to resist it. The power of naming is the power of definition, and whoever controls the definitions controls the reality. The historical context deepens this reading. In medieval Europe, a woman's legal status was defined by coverture, the legal doctrine that a married woman's legal rights were subsumed by her husband. She could not own property. She could not enter contracts. She could not keep her earnings. She existed legally as an extension of her husband. The miller's daughter moves from the legal control of her father to the legal control of the king, never achieving independent personhood. And even her biological function, her capacity to bear children, is subject to a contract she made when she had no other choice. The story doesn't critique this system openly. It couldn't, but it provides the tools for recognizing and potentially navigating it. One of the darkest theories regarding Rumpelstiltskin's motivation comes from Scottish folklore, specifically the concept of the fairy tithe, or teened to hell. In Scottish ballads like Tam Lin and Thomas the Rhymer, the fairy realm is not an independent paradise, but a tenant state of hell. Every 7 years, the fairy queen is required to pay a tenth, a tithe, of her population as living sacrifice to the devil. To avoid sacrificing their own kind, fairies kidnap human children, changelings, to pay this debt in mortal coin. This reframes Rumpelstiltskin's motivation entirely. He is not a magical creature who wants a baby because he desires to be a father. He is a desperate entity, seeking a soul to offer in his place to avoid being seized by what the ballads call a foul fiend of hell. The demand for the firstborn child is not about possession or control. It's about survival. The child is currency required to satisfy a demonic overlord, payment on a debt that comes due with mechanical regularity. The 7-year cycle appears throughout European fairy lore. Every 7 years, the tithe must be paid. Every 7 years, the fairies raid human settlements, stealing infants from cradles, leaving behind their own sickly offspring or enchanted logs that appear to be dead babies. The parents wake to find their child gone, replaced by something that looks almost right, but isn't. The changeling cries wrong, it ages wrong, it dies wrong. And the real child is gone forever, carried to the fairy realm to be sacrificed when the devil comes to collect his due. In this reading, Rumpelstiltskin's appearance follows a desperate timeline. He needs a child before his own debt comes due. The child demanded after a year of the queen's reign represents the rhythmic debt payment to the other world. The specific timing matters. He cannot simply steal any child. The contract must be honored. The mother must willingly promise the child, creating a binding agreement that transfers ownership from human parent to fairy creditor. Only then can the child be used as payment to hell. This tithe to hell theory aligns with details in the original Grimm version. When Rumpelstiltskin is defeated, when his name is spoken and his power collapses, he accuses the devil of revealing his name. Not God, not a fairy queen. the devil. This suggests he understands himself as part of a hierarchy of damnation, a failed con artist in a much larger, more terrifying game of spiritual foreclosure. He tried to secure his salvation by damning someone else's child, and his failure means his own debt will come due with no payment to offer. The concept of the changeling was not abstract folklore to medieval parents. Infant mortality rates were catastrophic. Children died suddenly and inexplicably. A healthy baby could sicken and die within days. Medical knowledge was minimal. When a child died or developed what we now recognize as disabilities or developmental disorders, parents needed an explanation. The changeling myth provided one. The fairies had stolen the real child and left a substitute. This belief, as dark as it sounds, offered a kind of comfort. Your real child wasn't dead. Your real child was alive somewhere in the fairy realm. The thing that died wasn't truly yours, but the changeling myth also served a darker function. It provided justification for infanticide. If a child was sickly, if it failed to thrive, if it seemed wrong in some indefinable way, declaring it a changeling meant it wasn't murder to let it die or even to actively kill it. Various folk methods existed for forcing fairies to return the real child, placing the suspected changeling on a hot shovel, leaving it exposed on a hillside overnight. Methods that would kill a human infant but supposedly force the fairies to return the real one. The tithe to hell and the changeling myth together created a framework for understanding and rationalizing the unbearable frequency of child death in pre-modern societies. Beyond the socio-economic and folkloric, Rumpelstiltskin acts as a map of psychosexual development. The imagery of the spindle, the straw, the locked room, these function as what Freudian theory calls a complicated topography of the female genital parts. This is not about reducing the story to crude symbolism, but about recognizing that fairy tales often encode anxieties about sexuality, reproduction, and the transition from childhood to adulthood. Freud's phallic stage, occurring between ages 3 and 6, is the period when children discover erogenous zones and begin forming sexual identity. The spindle functions as a classic phallic symbol, an object that can penetrate or injure. The girl's obsession and terror regarding the spinning wheel reflects what Freud would call an unacknowledged idea or repressed curiosity about male sexuality. She is locked in a room with a tool associated with female labor, but the work she must perform is impossible without intervention from a male figure who possesses knowledge and power she lacks. The threat of death, on pain of death, mirrors what Freud called castration anxiety found in the Oedipal conflict. The father, the king, the lawgiver, steps in to restrict the pleasure principle, demanding productivity instead of desire. The girl cannot simply be. She must produce, she must generate value, and if she fails, she is destroyed. This encodes the transition from childhood, where the child is valued for existence alone, to adulthood, where value is determined by productivity and reproduction. For the woman in Freudian terms, the child she produces acts as replacement for the absent penis, the symbol of power and agency she is denied in patriarchal society. The child becomes proof of her value, her contribution, her power to create life. Rumpelstiltskin's attempt to take the child is an attempt to recastrate the woman, stripping her of the symbol of realized femininity and power. He would leave her with nothing, not the gold, which belongs to the king, not her own identity, which was purchased with her jewelry, not even the child, which was promised before conception. This reading adds a chilling layer to the nightly visits. Rumpelstiltskin makes gold with the girl each night, which can be read as euphemism for sexual labor she is forced to perform to ensure survival. 3 nights of increasing intimacy. 3 exchanges that strip her of protection and identity, culminating in a promise that binds her future. The firstborn is his to take because he is the symbolic, if not literal, progenitor of the child born from this forbidden magic. The child carries his mark, his claim, his curse from the moment of conception. The locked room itself functions as symbolic representation of the female body, a space that should be private and protected but is penetrated by male authority. The king locks her in. Rumpelstiltskin enters. She has no control over who has access to this space. The straw represents the raw material of her body, the biological capacity for reproduction. The gold represents the value that can be extracted from that capacity. And the spinning, the repeated circular motion, the penetration of the spindle through the fibers encodes the sexual act itself, the transformation of raw biological material into something of value to the patriarch. Freud's theories are not universally accepted, and applying them to folklore requires caution. But the psychoanalytic reading reveals something important. Fairy tales are often about the anxieties of growing up, about the transition from the protected world of childhood to the dangerous world of adult sexuality and reproduction. The maiden locked in the room is at the threshold of this transition. She is old enough to be married, old enough to bear children, but she has not yet developed the knowledge or power to protect herself. Rumpelstiltskin represents the predatory forces that target women at this vulnerable moment, offering help that comes with costs designed to trap them permanently in cycles of extraction and control. What makes Rumpelstiltskin truly terrifying is not the imp himself, but the world he inhabits, a world that the story presents as normal. The king who threatens to execute a young woman if she cannot perform magic. The father who lies to elevate his own status, knowing his daughter will face the consequences. The legal system that allows children to be pledged as collateral. The economic structure that creates debts so crushing they can only be paid in human life. Rumpelstiltskin is a monster, but he exists because the world has created the conditions for his predation. This is the sovereign horror at the heart of the tale. The state itself, represented by the king, is the primary predator. The king's absolute power over his subjects includes the power to threaten arbitrary execution. He doesn't care if the girl actually has magic. He doesn't investigate whether the miller's claim is true. He simply seizes an opportunity to extract wealth through violence. The girl is locked in a room. She is given impossible tasks. She is told that failure means death. This is not romance. This is hostage-taking by the state. And when she somehow succeeds, when gold appears and the king believes she is valuable, what does he do? He marries her. But this is not reward. It is permanent captivity. She cannot leave. She cannot refuse. She has moved from the status of threatened execution victim to the status of asset too valuable to lose. Her marriage to the king ensures he maintains control of her supposed magic, her body, her future production. She has exchanged one form of imprisonment for another. The narrative's moral ambiguity is its most devastating feature. While the queen keeps her child, she remains married to the king who threatened her life. Her father remains unpunished for his lethal lie. The only loser is Rumpelstiltskin, the one who actually performed the labor that saved her life. This suggests that in the real world encoded in this folklore, the gold of the monarch is always purchased with the blood or servitude of subjects. The system perpetuates itself through extraction and violence. And the only path to momentary safety is precise, articulated knowledge of the demons that haunt the hearth. The story functioned as preparation. It told young women that their fathers might sacrifice them for status, that kings might threaten their lives to extract resources, that strangers might offer help that comes with unbearable cost, that the child they would someday bear might be claimed by forces they didn't understand. And it told them that survival required knowledge. Learn the names, understand the contracts, recognize predation even when it appears as salvation. Because in a world where you are property, where your body and your children are commodities, knowledge is the only weapon available. The sovereignty horror extends beyond individual tyranny to systemic extraction. The king doesn't personally need to be cruel or sadistic. He simply operates according to the logic of sovereign power, which is the logic of absolute control over life and death. The medieval doctrine of the king's two bodies held that the monarch possessed both a mortal physical body and an immortal political body that embodied the state itself. As the political body, the king was above law. His will was law. His demands could not be questioned. This is why the girl cannot appeal to justice. There is no justice outside the king's will. He has declared she must produce gold or die, and that declaration creates reality. This connects to what political theorists call the state of exception, the moment when normal legal protections are suspended and sovereign power operates without constraint. The girl exists in permanent state of exception. She has no rights the king is bound to respect. She cannot demand a trial. She cannot present evidence. She cannot appeal to higher authority. She exists at the mercy of sovereign will, and that will has decided she is valuable only if she can perform the impossible. This is the template for totalitarian power: the impossible demand, the threat of death, the suspension of rights, and the presentation of this horror as normal, as the natural order of things. By revealing Rumpelstiltskin's name, the queen does not just save a baby. She momentarily disrupts the entire machinery of the life debt, proving that even the most terrifying ritual can be broken by the power of identity and truth. But the victory is partial and temporary. The system that created Rumpelstiltskin, that created the conditions for his predation, remains intact. The king still rules absolutely. Fathers can still sacrifice daughters. Debts can still be paid in children. The world has not changed. One woman has managed to name her particular demon, and in doing so has won a single battle. This is why the story survives across 4,000 years. Not because it offers hope, but because it offers strategy. It tells you the enemy can be beaten but not destroyed. It maps the terrain of predation so you can navigate it with slightly better odds. It says your father will betray you, so trust yourself. Your husband may imprison you, so maintain your own knowledge. And when the stranger comes offering salvation, remember that everything has a price, and some prices are designed to be unpayable so the creditor can claim your future. The computational research that traced this narrative structure back to the Bronze Age revealed something profound. This story has survived longer than empires, longer than religions, longer than entire languages. It survived because every generation understood what it encoded. The parents teaching children to fear impossible debts. The women teaching daughters to guard their names and their promises. The survivors teaching the vulnerable how to recognize predation before it's too late. The story was never entertainment. It was a manual for navigating a world where power is extractive and salvation comes at a cost designed to destroy you. When the brothers Grimm collected these tales in the early 19th century, when they wrote down the stories that elderly peasant women whispered to them, they were capturing fragments of something ancient. They were legal scholars. They had seen court records. They knew about the investigations that went nowhere, about young girls who died under suspicious circumstances, about mothers who inherited daughters' dowries and marriage prospects. They took that horrific reality and wrapped it in just enough fantasy to make it tellable, but they left enough truth that anyone who knew where to look could see the warning underneath. Rumpelstiltskin is not a fairy tale. It is a crime scene preserved in narrative form, evidence disguised as entertainment. And once you recognize what you're really reading, the illusion collapses. The spinning of straw into gold was never about magic. It was about impossible demands made by those with absolute power over those with none. The firstborn child was never about a strange creature's desires. It was about the legal codes that made children into collateral and the economic systems that required human sacrifice to sustain themselves. The guessing of the name was never about cleverness. It was about the power of precise articulation, of calling horror by its true name so it can be recognized and potentially resisted. The story ends with Rumpelstiltskin tearing himself in half, destroying himself when his name is spoken. But the queen remains married to the king who threatened her life. She lives in the castle that was her prison. She raises her child in the system that tried to claim him as a payment. The victory is not escape but survival. The lesson is not that evil can be defeated, but that it can be named, and in naming, temporarily held at bay. The machinery of debt and extraction continues, but in this moment, one woman has learned the name of her demon and knows that knowledge to protect what matters most. The act of naming carries weight beyond the immediate story. In cultures that practiced true name magic, the revelation of a name was a moment of profound vulnerability. Your true name was never spoken aloud except in the most sacred or dangerous circumstances. You used public names, nicknames, titles, anything but the name that connected to your essence. To have your true name known by another was to give them power over your soul, your fate, your very existence. Rumpelstiltskin's mistake was not in having an unusual name, but in singing it aloud, in celebrating his anticipated victory by speaking the one thing that could destroy him. This connects to a broader truth about power and resistance. Those who hold power operate most effectively when their mechanisms remain invisible, unnamed, naturalized as the way things are. The moment you name the mechanism, the moment you articulate precisely how power operates and what it extracts, you create the possibility of resistance. You cannot resist what you cannot see. You cannot fight what you cannot name. The Queen's victory is not in physical strength or magical power, but in epistemology, in the knowledge of her enemy's true nature. And that knowledge, passed down through 4,000 years of retelling, is the gift the story offers. That is the only victory the story promises. Not escape from the system, not transformation of the conditions that create predation, but the knowledge that allows you to recognize the predator, to name the threat, and in naming it, to potentially survive. And for 4,000 years, it has been enough to keep the warning alive, encoded in the tale of a girl locked in a room with straw she cannot spin, and a stranger who offers help at a price that grows heavier with every passing night until she learns the one word that can set her free.